to major arrests in the UK, huge accountability around the world with a lot of calls for more action, including inside the United States. I want to do a breakdown about Jean-Luc Brunel, who is a figure that we've now learned from the new files was actually pursued as a potential co-conspirator of Epstein's by the DOJ. Later was finally arrested and in a French prison where he was found dead, and authorities said that he took his own life. The files have released a lot more information about him, including something that was not known in great detail, which is how he ultimately, at one point, appeared to turn on Epstein and might have cooperated with U.S. authorities. Then that fell apart, and the Wall Street Journal reported this, and I'm going to get into the details. And then they didn't appear in the U.S. to pursue him, even though the whole plan was to give him immunity to flip on Epstein. Anyone who's seen a mafia movie or knows how this works, yeah, you flip to get immunity so you don't get in trouble for your exposure or crimes by giving enough valid, usable information on someone else, usually someone you did crimes with. Well, if he offered that and wanted that, and there's evidence of that, why, when he didn't cooperate, when he didn't give up that information ultimately on Epstein, why didn't they pursue him? People who want immunity usually need it. So that's a big question hanging over all of this. I'm Ari Melbrough, a lawyer and journalist. You can subscribe for my updates and reports. I've done other pieces on Epstein, including previously about Brunel and the mystery around him. So I'm going to do this with some of the information. The article is by Khadija Safdar in the Wall Street Journal, and I would urge anyone to also take a look at that because I'm going to be drawing on that and the files. But the beginning of all this starts with something we would never normally see, I can tell you as a lawyer. You don't see investigative case files from the FBI and others, and there's good reasons for that sometimes. Here, Congress, under the pressure from the public and people concerned about this, has changed that rule. It's just a law. Laws change. And so one of the most important files, which you can look up, was this confidential, and you see that marked, FBI handwritten notes. The FBI often in these type of scenarios, obviously they have the tools everyone else has, but they will do handwritten, which is harder to leak, et cetera, although over time, of course, it can be saved. And this was an FBI file that says one of Epstein's, it says what appears to say BFs, best friends perhaps, Jean-Luc Brunel has, quote, helped get girls. He is wanting to cooperate. And it goes on to discuss a plan for that and that he's hired a lawyer and how that would work. And so these are notes that date all the way back to a period where Brunel was believed to have considered cooperating. If you haven't heard of him, if you haven't followed this case as closely, he's one of the key officials because he held himself out as a kind of modeling scout. He did, and that's debated over whether he was actually an alleged sex trafficker, but that was one of the tools they would use. He went into businesses that had arrangements with Epstein. He was on the flights a lot. So his name was one of those that had been around before. But when we, as investigative journalists and others, got a hold of more files, including late last year, it got worse, or you could see from the files how much he was on the plane, how much more he was in the emails. These are things that people often would minimize or lie about. So when you get the goods and the records, and now you're looking at two people, Brunel and Epstein, who are both deceased, both, by the way, while awaiting trial, and we can get into that, gives you a different view. So what we learn is that basically, going back to 2016, Brunel had representatives, lawyers, who were negotiating about potentially providing information on Epstein and what would have been a sex trafficking operation. February 2016, in the FBI's view, which again we only are learning recently as people comb through these files, quote, Brunel's afraid of being prosecuted. So that was the view they had. I showed you those notes. Then you have a link to Kathy Rumler, who was a longtime Democratic lawyer with ties to the White House. She was at White House counsel in the Obama-Biden era, and was recently, I should mention, ousted from Goldman Sachs and said she resigned over how much of this heat had built up over the Epstein files. But basically, Epstein discovers that there were these negotiations. He emails her. Now she wasn't ever registered as his attorney. To this day, she says she was not an Epstein representative, but he emails her about it. That's striking because the question is about all of her ties to government, and said that Epstein believed Brunel was going to go to the feds next week one of Brunel's friends, and this may or may not be true, I want to be clear, this is just what Epstein is saying, and sometimes he lied, but he says that Brunel's friends had asked for $3 million, so for him not to go in. That itself, by the way, is obviously potentially illegal if it is a payment to obstruct justice. And Epstein's pushing Rumler because he says he thinks she can provide more information. She replies by email and talks about talking to people involved. There's a reference to basically Epstein, and I'm looking at the email to get this exactly right, writing to Rumler May 2016, saying he spoke to Jean-Luc's friend, that he's looking at, quote, full immunity and is talking to the U.S. attorney next Tuesday. He asked for $3 million, Epstein alleges, so that Brunel would not go in. We don't know from the files what else happened about money. What we do know, and the Journal goes into this in some detail, is that Brunel did not ultimately cooperate. One of the lawyers for victims advocates, I should say one of the lawyers who's an advocate for victims, who's also kind of a big super lawyer we've heard of, David Boies, does a lot of stuff. He says it set us back a couple years in terms of the lawsuits he had on behalf of victims. We know from our lawsuits there were, quote, over 50 girls trafficked after this. So when people get into how this matters and what happened over time, that's a fairly respected lawyer who works on behalf of alleged Epstein survivors and victims, saying what happened after, how much more abuse allegedly took place because they didn't pursue the Brunel lead. As for Brunel's attorney, again, remember, he's now deceased. He told the Journal, as part of this piece, that he told Brunel to cooperate, to cut ties with Epstein. I recommended, quote, and advised him to stop communicating with Epstein, but he never did, his lawyer says. Pretty striking, because if they continued to correspond or collaborate, that could involve what lawyers call the crime of obstruction of justice, where Brunel is potentially going to help the feds, but then instead of dropping a dime on this guy, Epstein, he turns around and perhaps allegedly continued to help Epstein or took money, etc. I want to be clear, those are things Epstein emailed about. We don't know whether that next step took place. And then I told you, I've talked about this on earlier reports, ultimately it was France, Brunel was an international operator, it was France that arrested him in 2020. The charges were related, sexual assault, rape, and trafficking girls to Epstein. It was in 2022, so a much longer duration than what Epstein had, when he was found dead in his cell, and the government there ruled it a suicide. I just want to go through and, again, in detail, which is how I'm doing these, look at what we've learned, again, only from the files. Had these investigative files not come out, I would be talking to you about little shards of this. We knew about Brunel and we knew about the flight logs. We didn't know the DOJ had identified